Your reaction, please, when you read Rosie DiManno's column last week.
Yeah, I mean, first I want to say I did reach out to Rosie DiManno. We did have an email exchange. I invited her on this very show. She declined that invitation. I didn't really pursue the Toronto Star to respond in their pages. Instead, I'm grateful to do that here. I did tweet at them several times, though, Matt, although they did not respond. I guess my response, I wanted to say surprise, Matt, because I wish that was actually truthful, but I to be really honest, I think I'm sort of beyond being surprised anymore about these things. I'm a bit amazed that the Indigenous sports mascot issue is still an issue, let alone the dialogue around it, that it's still an issue in 2016. But again, I don't think ultimately that's the reaction. I think my real reaction was frustrations. I mean, mascots really shouldn't be this important. They shouldn't have to generate this sort of debate, especially when there are so many more urgent issues in my community. But their presence makes addressing those issues more difficult. And so here we are again, Matt, talking about this, hopefully for the last time. I was also very frustrated with the media. I've been privileged. This is my 20th year, Matt, with the CBC. And I've spent much of that time on the air here on this very show. And I've generally found this to be very supportive of me and Indigenous voices in general. But the reality is in the Canadian media, it is not a diverse space, particularly when it comes to columnists. There aren't very many diverse voices that get a space of a column in a paper such as the Toronto Star. And like issues, we were talking about last week around things like the Oscars, I mean, those are just a symptom of a much larger systemic issue around diversity and inclusion that I think the larger culture is struggling with. And I think columns like this are also indicative of that. So I think frustration was ultimately the emotion.
So let's respond directly to the piece. Why do you think we, as a society, need to do away with Indigenous mascots and logos?
Well, okay, and I realize what I'm now going to say in terms of the column is diluting a word, but it's because I do think Indigenous logos are racist, because they are byproduct ultimately of colonialism. That they're ever even championed as being honorific is a symbol of sort of colonial violence. Listen, sports mascots themselves are not the reason my community continues to suffer with things like clean water or lack of it, poverty, suicide, mass incarceration. They are all byproducts of the same sort of colonial culture that is responsible for these sorts of things. DiManno says in her column that we're all allowed to borrow because no one owns history. And I fundamentally disagree with this argument,
Why?
Matt, because to me, Indigenous sports mascots are an exemplar of history being owned. And it's a privilege, and it's only privilege that actually denies that, not political correctness, not censorship. She defends the local team name, the Mississauga Mohawks, by saying that Mississauga is an Anishinaabe word, which is true. I will agree with her on that. But of course, missing the fact that Mohawks are Haudenosaunee, and thus even the idea of Mississauga Mohawks is as a colonial idea, conflating two very different groups of people. Thus, I think we can, as Indigenous people, say why we find insults in these names. It's very colonial in its very approach. And we don't even have to get to more obvious examples like the Redskins, which is a name so blatantly offensive in its construct. It's amazing that it still persists today. Or the Cleveland Indians and their chief Wahoo caricature.
Atlanta Braves.
The Atlanta Braves. And all teams, by the way, Matt, and I'm a longtime baseball lover, that I turn the channel when they come on these days.
So you don't buy the argument that these names are affectionate or empowering, as she says?
I think that they can only be seen as affectionate when you come from a colonial worldview. I don't think that is actually how cultures behave with one another when they don't come from ultimately a patriarchal and colonial world nature. They are symbols ultimately of the oppression and the violence that occurred on this land to make Indigenous people go away. And I would point out that when a lot of these names, because one of the arguments in the piece is that these names have a history and a legacy, and people are very attached to them. And it is true. Many of these names were designed 100 or so years ago. A point when it was logical for the people that were making these names to think that they would never have to encounter Indigenous resistance to these names, because both governments, north and south of the border, were actively involved in genocide against Indigenous people. So the idea that someone would then raise 80 years later that maybe these are offensive would never rightfully have crossed their mind, because it wasn't the actual what was going on.
But those are different times. Why is this still an issue now, do you think?
I think it's because colonial cultures are terrible at self-realization. We get into very uncomfortable conversations like the one we're having now, and that discomfort for the overculture is not something that they embrace, particularly here in Canada. Cynically, I worry that they won't go away because of money, because of media coverage like this, that this sells paper and that there's money involved. But I think all of that's true. I think it's also a symbol of where Indigenous people fall in the cultural ladder. But I want to end by saying this, Matt.
Yeah.
These names and logos, they've always been racist. They were racist when they were conceived. The big difference now is that the marginalized people that these logos depict now have a voice. There's now things like the Equity Summit Group to write a letter to say it's wrong. That's what's changed. I'm here, not in the residential schools like my grandmother and the aunties. I have a voice, and I'm telling you now what they would tell you, which is we're not your mascots, we're human beings.
Thank you. Jesse Wente covers pop culture
Miigwech, Matt.
on Metro Morning.